You'll hear that. Good. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Rachel Nolan. Rachel is a historian, professor at Boston University. She's the author of Until I Find You, Disappeared Children and Coercive Adoptions in Guatemala. Rachel has lived and studied in Guatemala. Her research focuses on the circumstances and processes that make children from poorer countries available for adoption in wealthier countries. Before becoming a historian, she worked as a journalist, and Rachel writes for the New Yorker, New York Review of Books, and Harper's Magazine, where she's a contributing editor. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I wanted to really thank the Adoption Network Cleveland for this invitation. Obviously, this book concerns adoptees and adoptive families and birth families most personally. So I know we'll probably have a couple people from those groups. And I just want to welcome everyone. Say thank you to Ty for her introduction to the group, and congratulate Betsy Norris also on the work that she's been doing. So we had a chance to talk a little bit before this. So before I kind of launch into describing the research that I've done over the last decade and some of the things that I found and how they might be germane to some of you or useful information, I just want to say I'm going to give an informal presentation tonight. I'm not going to use slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a situation in Guatemala, which you may or may not know much about. So the question for me always is, how did you get involved in this? And I want to say from the outset that I'm not part of the adoption triad myself. I was living and working in Mexico as a journalist before I started my PhD. And I started my PhD and was reading the history of Central America and was really drawn in by the conflict, the Civil War that occurred there from 1960 to 1996. 200,000 people were killed during that conflict. And I really asked myself, why is this not better known in the United States? And so I was doing some reading and some archival research, as historians do, around some of the issues related to the Civil War, and was really surprised and alarmed to discover that some of the war crimes involved not just killing people, but forcibly disappearing children who had a variety of different outcomes. Some of them were put up for adoption domestically within Guatemala. Some people served as domestic servants, and others were put up for adoption in the United States. And I read this and I thought, how could that be, right? How could U.S. families be involved in this type of occurrence? And that started me on the process of trying to get to Guatemala, trying to read some adoption files. And again, I want to say from the outset that this is not the vast majority of cases. So I talk a lot in the book about some of these war crimes and some of the children who were forcibly disappeared in Guatemala. Those children are estimated to be from 500 to about 800 children who were forcibly disappeared over the course of the war. This is a tragic and enormous number. Obviously, it's equal to the number of children who were forcibly disappeared in the armed conflict in Argentina, which is a lot better known in the United States. But what I realized when I was doing research on some of these cases was that I really wanted to write about them, and some of the adoption files were actually made available in Guatemala, and I can talk about why and how I was able to access some of those adoption files. But what I realized when I was starting to do this research on adoptions from Guatemala is that this was a tiny part of a much bigger phenomenon. And in fact, there had been a total of roughly 40,000 Guatemalans adopted internationally, so in the US, in Canada, and in Europe. And of that 40,000, only a very small number, under 1,000, went through state orphanages. And of those who went through state orphanages, a smaller percentage still were kind of victims of the war crimes that I just mentioned right at the outset. So I thought, will there be a way to kind of research this broader phenomenon of international adoption, and what are all of these cases that are not going through state orphanages? So that opened up a kind of second avenue of research when I was trying to understand this very unusual phenomenon that occurred, to the best of my knowledge, just in Guatemala, which is a form of privatized adoption that went through a lawyer rather than through a family court or through an orphanage. And what I learned from reading Guatemalan congressional records is that those were made legal in the 1970s. So again, some of you on the call may know this, but Guatemala was one of the few countries in the world starting in the 1970s where you could do an adoption by getting in touch with a private lawyer. The lawyer would find you a child, and we can talk a little bit about how that happened in the legal cases and in the not so legal cases and in the illegal cases. But the lawyer was in charge of finding the child, generally not from an orphanage. And the lawyer did the entire process, right? Matched the families, did the reports, and received a sum of money that could represent upwards of US $10,000, which is a large sum in Guatemala at that time as it is today. So as a historian, what I realized quickly was that there was a lot of fear and a lot of myths about adoptions in Guatemala. If you travel to Guatemala and start asking people about adoptions, you'll hear a lot of stories about what are called robachicos, like people, robaniños, people who stole children, kidnappings. And yes, there are a couple documented cases, more than a couple, several dozen documented cases of kidnappings for-profit adoptions from Guatemala. But what you don't hear are some of the kind of nuances. And I thought, as a historian, I can't just report on, or as a journalist even, I can't just report on the rumors, right? There are all of these rumors circulating about international adoptions. It's going to be important to try to look at some of the paperwork. And here is where my historical research started to resemble some of the personal research of adoptees that I have since been in touch with or had the pleasure to be friendly with through this research, which is to say, the research was very frustrating. If you are trying to get accurate records in Guatemala, it can be an enormous source of frustration. If you were one of the children who was adopted through the state orphanage, your records are held at the Ministry of Social Welfare, the Ministerio de Bienestar Social. You can go there in person, you can request them. It's kind of, for an outside researcher, it's the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act request. It's under the law of public access to information in Guatemala. You can access those files, or at least I was able to for a time and then later not. I obviously use pseudonyms in my book for children who were affected by adoption and for birth parents, as well as for adoptive families. There's no identifying information. But if you are a child who was given for adoption through the private adoption system, it's much more difficult to trace those papers. And if you are a researcher trying to kind of get a handle on what happened with this enormous number of adoptions, it is very difficult to get even basic information. So for example, what percentage of international adoptions went to the US versus other countries? It's actually, because the system was private, it's impossible to know even really basic data. We have good numbers on how many children were adopted into the United States. It was just over 29,000 children adopted in the United States, only because the US government keeps accurate records of visas given to those children. But within Guatemala, some of that information is really hard to find. So when I was researching my book, I wanted to, be able to at least talk to some of the lawyers who were involved in these cases. So I thought, okay, I can read the adoption files from the state orphanages, and I did that, and I can talk with you all about some of my findings from reading the state orphanage cases. But the private adoption files, my best attempt was to talk to the lawyers at first. And to my great surprise, they all wanted to talk to an outsider, especially a North American, an academic. And what I quickly realized was, because of all the rumors that circulated in Guatemala about how children, I want to say right at the outset, none of these rumors were true, to the best of my knowledge, to the best of my ability to confirm ever. But there were these somewhat horrifying rumors about adoptions in the 1990s relating to organ trafficking, that the children were not really being put up for adoption in the US, but were in fact being killed, their organs extracted and sold on the international market. I later sort of started to understand some of these fears in reference to organ trafficking rumors in other countries where there are powerful outsiders who are wielding some kind of influence in that country. So for example, there are similar rumors in poor parts of Brazil, right? And the US did wield an outsized influence in Guatemala during these years. And the US, of course, is a wealthier country that was seen as interfering in Guatemalan affairs at that time. So you can kind of understand where the rumors came from. Nevertheless, the rumors of organ trafficking were completely false. They circulated so widely in Guatemala that the lawyers really did want to talk to me to kind of clear it up and say, none of this ever happened when it came to adoptions from Guatemala. And what's more, because adoptions were closed from Guatemala in 2008, a lot of the lawyers that had previously worked on privatized adoptions wanted to reopen them. So they were sharing with me their techniques, their kind of ways of working in the hopes that I would convince a North American audience that international adoptions were to be reopened. I asked all of these lawyers if I could have access to their adoption files, basically if I could read their files, which is like standard investigative journalism, basically, to say, like, it's nice what you are telling me in this conversation, but, you know, it would be more helpful if I could see some of the documentation. Most of them said no for privacy reasons, which is completely understandable. And one, Fernando Linares Beltranena, who is a pretty well-known conservative politician in Guatemala, said, sure, come on in. I have no problem sharing my adoption records. I did nothing wrong. And, you know, please disguise the identities. You know, if you're going to write about any of these cases, don't name the families. You know, he had similar ground rules to the government officials who allowed me to access files related to state orphanages, but he allowed me to sit in his law office for several weeks and read his adoption files. And what I learned, the picture that I got, both from state orphanage files and from private adoption files, was similar with one major difference. The similarity, and this will be familiar to everyone at Adoption Network Cleveland, I'm sure, is the mothers who relinquished children for adoption were living in states of poverty or extreme poverty. The one baseline similarity that I could see was women were extremely impoverished and facing very constricted life choices. It's worth keeping in mind that in Guatemala, when adoptions were open, abortion was not legal, and abortion is still not legal in Guatemala. So layer that with misogyny and anti-Indigenous sentiment, which I'm going to discuss a little bit further. Women found themselves in extremely constrained situations. So attempting to understand which adoptions were consensual, whatever that might mean, and which adoptions were coercive, whatever that might mean, is made very complex by these structuring circumstances. The other thing that I found was that there was a high presence of what the lawyers sometimes called mediators. So the mediators were women who worked with adoption lawyers in order to find adoptable children for families. The way that this generally worked, starting in the 1980s in Guatemala and through the 1990s and to the 2000s, was that sometimes an adoption lawyer would hear about a child who the mother wished to relinquish for adoption, maybe before that child was born, maybe after, you know, when that person was a baby. They might hear about that person naturally through, one lawyer told me it was a domestic servant who worked in my house who told me that one of her friends had a child who she wanted to put up for adoption. So sometimes that social network could happen naturally. Mostly, however, these connections crossed really significant class divisions within Guatemala. And so I think this is something that's worth emphasizing for a US audience, is that we think of the, you know, class or, you know, income division being between United States, wealthy country, and Guatemala, poor country. But what I learned by reading the adoption files and by doing this research is that it's the income inequality within Guatemala. It's the kind of social division within Guatemala that made a lot of children adoptable in the first instance. So if you have not traveled to Guatemala, you might be surprised to land and hear a lot of helicopters. Those are the ultra wealthy traveling from the capital to the countryside. It is an extremely divided country in terms of wealth. And the poor are extremely poor without any kind of social welfare safety net, right? So that's something I really want to emphasize. Again, the word coercive is in the title of my book. but some of it is the kind of slow coercion of grinding poverty, rather than someone, holding a gun to another person's head and saying, you must give me your baby now. That's not the scenario that most people should imagine for some of these cases. The last thing that I want to mention, at the risk of going on too long, because I'm sure you have questions for me and I'd rather have a kind of back and forth than hearing my own voice, is what's really crucial to understand for adoptions from Guatemala, especially for those of you who are not involved in these families. I can see people on the call who know a lot more, who know much about this, so I don't want to make any assumptions. But for those who don't know as much about the Guatemalan context, roughly 40 to 50% of the population is Maya Indigenous. So they speak one of 22 Mayan languages, possibly in addition to Spanish, although many women in particular from rural areas can be monolingual, really speaking a Mayan Indigenous language as their primary language, not being so fluent in Spanish. And so this is one of the highest percentages of Indigenous population anywhere in the Americas. Bolivia, Peru, Guatemala, these are like the highly Indigenous countries of Latin America, right? And what that means in the Guatemalan context is that there has been anti-Indigenous violence and discrimination since the conquest, but really in waves. And one of the most important anti-Indigenous waves of violence anywhere in the Americas was the 1980s in Guatemala, where there has since been a trial for genocide against the former dictator of that country during the 36-year conflict that I mentioned. And Efrain Rios Montt was tried and convicted for genocide against certain Indigenous groups. So the kind of level of anti-Indigenous discrimination and violence is extremely high in Guatemala. So it may not be surprising that, although it is horrifying, that when you read the adoption files from the conflict years, you see much larger numbers of Indigenous children being given up for adoption than any other group. That pattern disappears if you look at the kind of larger group, at least from what I was able to see for private adoptions, where the economic condition of the birth families really seems much more predictive or relevant than their ethnic identity. So when I was reading adoption files from private adoptions after the war years, it was a lot of women who lived in Guatemala City, were extremely impoverished, maybe worked as domestic servants, but they may have been Maya Indigenous or they may not. The kind of final thing that I want to mention before I start taking questions is one major frustration of trying to do any research on this topic, whether you are a historian or an adoptee or an adoptive parent, is falsified paperwork. And this is something that can be very disturbing for families to find out after the fact, especially if they have not considered it. So I want to mention two groups that work with adoptees as support groups in general. It doesn't just have to be around falsified paperwork. But there is Next Generation Guatemala, which is run by the wonderful Gemma Givens, and there is Adoptees with Guatemala, run by Ben Fawcett. So these are two groups based in the US. Ty is going to send out some of this information after our session. So if you haven't connected with those groups, I recommend it in the sense that I'm a historian and not part of the groups because they are for adoptees, but I just wanted to mention that because in my conversations with adoptees, the kind of question of what to do about either falsified or potentially falsified paperwork has been especially vexing, especially difficult. So I wanted to mention that. But as a kind of challenge, falsified paperwork means that you kind of hit a brick wall, right? If you know that the wrong name has been used for a birth mother, if you know that the place of origin has not been recorded correctly, it's really difficult in today's context in Guatemala to get accurate information about where you came from. I know that some families have found DNA testing to kind of turn up some surprise closure to their cases after the fact, but that's not guaranteed. And so one of the things that makes adoptions from Guatemala so difficult to research or understand is not knowing how far to trust the paperwork. So even a common question that I get is, how many adoptions from Guatemala were illegal? Or how many adoptions from Guatemala were fraudulent? And even though I have spent many years of my life trying to understand this documentation, I don't have an answer for that. And anyone who is a serious scholar will not have an answer for that because if a piece of paper is fraudulent, is falsified, there's no way of knowing that unless the people in the document have each been contacted, or there's some reason to find that that paperwork was falsified. In the same way, if a adoption was fraudulent, unless it's a really obvious case, like Edmond Mulet, the former presidential candidate from Guatemala, who was involved in some adoption rings in the 1980s, he literally took out, Edmond Mulet is a fairly prominent politician in Guatemala, and he was, let me be careful here so he does not object, which is fair enough. He was investigated twice and released from prison twice for adoption-related cases in the 1980s. And what he had done was get tourist visas for babies who were going to be placed in Canada. That's illegal. You can't take out an adoptee on a tourist visa from Guatemala. So those are cases where the paperwork is very obviously fraudulent. Most of the cases are subtler than that, right? It's a woman who signed a piece of paper relinquishing a child who was not really the birth mother of that child. These are not things that are immediately obvious from the paperwork. So the kind of picture that I want to leave you all with, and then I can take questions from anyone in the audience. I know we already have a couple questions that came, or a question that Ty said came through, is a very complex picture of adoption from Guatemala during the years that it was open, from the 1960s to 2008. A vast, like a real variety of different cases, everything from, Swedish families adopting children from state orphanages with 200-page adoption files that I was able to consult, right, in the 1960s, to private adoptions where the lawyers have all the paperwork and no one is ever going to be able to consult that paperwork unless they were immediately party to that adoption. And maybe that's the way things should be. To, Ixil children who were victims of the war, who were forcibly taken from their families, their identities changed, and then put up for adoption in the United States or elsewhere internationally, all the way to children who were put up for adoption whose cases were frozen in 2007 as Guatemala was trying to work out whether they were going to reform adoption in the country or whether adoption would be closed entirely. And there were over 3,000 cases that were frozen in 2007. So I mention all of this as a kind of broad swathe of difference. The last thing that I'm going to say is it's very, very, very difficult to even guess at the experiences of birth families from a lot of the existing records. These are the people, the parties, however you want to think about them, the part of the adoption triad that really fall out of the picture if you're trying to do research on this topic in Guatemala. The reason is, I didn't consider it ethical to contact birth mothers. There's all kinds of reasons that would not have been ethical, despite the fact that their old contact information was in a lot of these adoption files. So if you hear interviews with them at all, or if you kind of can get a sense of why they were relinquishing children for adoption, they're very mediated in the written sources. These were written down by social workers who were attempting to close an adoption file, or these were written down by lawyers who were earning money through finalizing the adoption. So that's not to say that what is in those files is inaccurate in any fundamental way, but it is very different as a researcher to read those kinds of documents than it would be to be able to sit down with someone during the process, after the process, 20 years after the process, and none of that was available to me. So I want to make that really clear as part of this presentation as well. Okay, thanks. And I will take any and all questions.
We had a couple of questions that came through. One through the registration process. One of our registrants asked what families can do if they're concerned their child's adoption was fraudulent.
I just want to acknowledge how painful that question might be. I am a mere historian, and I discussed this a little bit with Betsy and Ty before we began. I'm a historian and a journalist, and not really qualified to answer some of these questions, but I'm not going to dodge it because I'm trying to think what expertise might I have here that would be useful. There are groups within Guatemala that are helping to search for birth families, especially in cases where there are concerns that the paperwork might have been fraudulently changed. I want to mention La Liga de Higiene Mental. I'm going to pass some of these this information to Tai so she can send it out to everyone who participated today. This is run by Marco Garavito, known to everyone as Mako, in Guatemala City. And that group started in the 1980s. It's a very small nonprofit that started by searching for some of the Indigenous children, mostly Indigenous, not all Indigenous, some of the children who were forcibly disappeared during the war. So when families had young children taken by the military, I do want to emphasize that the conflict in Guatemala, over 90% of the violence was perpetrated by the military. This was state terror in a lot of ways. So if a family had a child taken by the military and were searching for that child, they worked with Mako's group to find, did that child end up with a Guatemalan family? Did they end up adopted internationally? And this group has overseen to date over 450, I believe, reunions between families and children who have been found. So Mako's group has also started working on some more recent cases that did not have to do with the war. So I want to point people toward him, especially because it's a nonprofit group. If you have concerns and you are still in touch with your lawyer in Guatemala City, it might be worthwhile to sit down and have a kind of neutral conversation with that person, maybe using the word mediator. I came across the word jaladora quite frequently. That's Jaladora. Jaladora in Spanish has a very soap opera-ish kind of quality. What it means is someone who pulls someone else. So jaladora is sometimes what women who worked with lawyers to literally pull children for adoption were called within Guatemala. Lawyers do not respond well to that word, understandably, because it kind of elicits some of those rumors that I discussed and some of the more negative side. Lawyers often did not want to talk about jaladoras at all because they're in a kind of liminal space of legality. You were allowed under law at that time to pay someone to do that task, but if any of that money made its way to the birth mother, obviously that's illegal. So the lawyers were very hesitant to talk about mediators or jaladoras, but if you ask them about the approach, about the kind of community around the birth mother, you might get a little bit more information about how that worked. The problem is if the lawyer really was working fraudulently, they may have been part of an adoption ring themselves. So it may not be that terribly useful to go to that person. If you worked with Susana Luarca, for example, she's one of the few who was caught and is in fact in jail in Guatemala now, serving a sentence for child trafficking for adoption. So DNA testing, if you suspect that it's fraudulent and related to the Civil War, certainly there's a group of forensic anthropologists called FAFRE. I will also pass this information to Tai, who work with people who suspect that they may have been one of the wartime adoptions. That group is active, and funding in Guatemala is really limited though, right? Even getting something like a DNA bank going is quite difficult. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on in case there are other questions, but my sympathies for a really difficult situation.
Can you talk a little bit about how and why and when adoption from Guatemala was stopped?
Sure. So I want to acknowledge the work of a wonderful journalist named Erin Siegel McIntyre, who did a lot of the Freedom of Information request acts that allowed me to answer this question. So she sent me a lot of information that she'd gotten doing FOIAs on diplomatic cables that the US Embassy in Guatemala was sending to Washington. So one of my major questions was, if there was adoption fraud, when did the US Embassy know? And when did they act? And how much space was there between those two things? And reading those cables, it's really clear that the US Embassy in Guatemala was well aware of adoption fraud back in the early 1980s. And by adoption fraud, I mean practices like, having women sign who were not necessarily the birth mother, or, some coercion of women into relinquishing children for adoption, or birth mothers perhaps imagining that they might have a long-term relationship with the child and not understanding the kind of finality of international adoption. So I found those cables really disturbing to read. And it's only in the 1990s that you see the US Embassy getting really concerned about adoption fraud. They acknowledge it as early as the 1980s. They're getting really concerned about it in the 1990s. And then in the 2000s, by reading the cables, you can see this kind of push and pull between, on the one hand, embassy staff in Guatemala saying, we are understaffed, we do not have the capacity to prevent adoption fraud, please send us more staff, right? They instituted DNA testing for mothers that gave a certain level of comfort to adoptive families, right? To know what they were getting themselves into. Then some of those DNA testing schemes were thought to have been fraudulent, so they instituted DNA testing that had to be sent to the US, all of these issues, right? Meanwhile, that's pushing on the one hand. On the other hand, you see cables saying there is a well-connected adoptive family in Louisiana, in New York, in Massachusetts that is pushing to speed up the adoption, right? And what are the delays? What's the red tape? So you get this kind of, you even have senators flying to Guatemala to kind of investigate why things are so slow. And that's all very understandable. But what you're getting is a lot of pressure from the US side to have the adoptions continue flowing. There was a real backlash in Guatemala in the 1990s. There were some speeches, there were some demonstrations in Guatemala City. And it's still really hard to account for what caused for the closure exactly. It was the Hague Conventions coming into effect. It was the Guatemalan backlash. It was the activism of some Guatemalan women who accused foreigners of having taken children out of the country who had been kidnapping victims. It was a kind of perfect storm that caused closure in 2008 in Guatemala.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that background. We've heard that women were sometimes hired to get pregnant to place a child for adoption. Did you see evidence of that?
This was a rumor that I had heard that I never found evidence of. And I want to be very clear that that does not mean it didn't happen because of the really imperfect documentation. But on the Guatemalan side, even in the Guatemalan newspapers from the 80s and 90s, I was reading about so-called casas de engorde, which in English would be fattening houses, where women who were paid to get pregnant would stay and then, give up their children for adoption. I never found any evidence that that was anything other than a figment of someone's imagination, right? I spoke with a Guatemalan reporter who wrote a lot about adoption during those years in the 80s, and he helped explain to me what was well sourced, what was kind of subject to cover-ups, i.e., high military officials who were involved in adoption rings. That was a reality, but the kind of women, they were also called in Spanish kangaroo mothers, like women who were hired to become pregnant. That was nothing I ever found in the police archives, for example. So I can't say definitively it never happened, but I never found evidence that it had.
I wanted to point out in the chat, there's a really sweet note from an adoptee adopted in 1991 with her brother who is complimenting your book and also just thanking you for this work that you've done. Nice.
Oh, thank you. That's from Maria Hense. Thank you so much. I realized when I was writing it, as a historian, you would tend to focus on the worst case scenario, right? You would tend to focus on the war crimes, the children who were forcibly disappeared during the armed internal conflict, and some of the kidnappings that did happen before adoption. And all of that is very real. But I realized at a certain point when I was writing it that by only foregrounding those things, there were all of these other more complex stories that were going to get left out. And I wanted adoptees to be able to read my book and think there may be some part of this story that I fit into. And if I only had the absolute worst case scenarios, that's just not accurate, right? That's not correct. So thank you for that lovely note.
I'm going to put the link for your book in the chat so that anyone who's wanting to read that and learn more about your research and your work, you can order that there. I just put that in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about you had mentioned with birth mothers it being unethical to interview them. Can you expand on your thinking on those lines?
Sure. I also just want to mention really briefly about my book. If it is, get in touch with me if you want a copy of it, right? This is something that I want to be freely available to adoptees, in particular birth families. And, Linda Gordon, a historian I really admire, wrote a book about the birth control pill called The Moral Property of Women. And this book is the moral property of the people it concerns, as far as I think. So get in touch with me if you're having trouble accessing it for any reason. Anyway, the question about birth mothers and ethically contacting birth mothers. I did interview a searcher at some point, and I know many Guatemalan adoptees have worked with searchers to try to find their birth parents in Guatemala, which can sometimes be extremely complex. And the searcher that I interviewed, who asked that I not use her name, so I respected that, of course, in my book, and I will continue to respect that. She did allow me to talk about her approach, which was when she had an address, she would go to that person's house, but she wouldn't say, "I'm here on behalf of your adopted child. They can't wait to get in touch with you," because of course that may have been a secret. This woman it may have been a very difficult circumstance in her life. She may have since partnered with someone else who doesn't know about this story. There are all kinds of reasons that could be a difficult disclosure. And so she would say simply, she told me, "I have an envelope from someone in the United States." And most people in Guatemala have someone in the United States because of migration patterns, because of all kinds of connections between Guatemala and the US. That's not such a strange thing. It sounds almost like remittances or money that someone's sending you from the US or a cousin that went to the US. It just isn't that weird. So I was thinking to myself, is there any ethical way that I would get in touch in that kind of way? And I just thought, no, that kind of contact really only makes sense when there's a family reunification possibility. There are rules for researchers. There's something called the IRB, which is supposed to protect what are called vulnerable subjects during research. It really only protects universities from liability, honestly. In many cases now, like it should protect vulnerable subjects, but it often doesn't. Even if I could get that kind of interview past the IRB, it didn't seem ethical to me to try. But that left me in the not so great position when I'm trying to explain these dynamics to outsiders who don't know Guatemalan history or politics very well. The major player is missing, right? Or the major player is there insofar as I can glean the birth mother's perspective from existing documentation, which, as I've just said, is often inaccurate. There is an additional complication with Indigenous languages. If I were to get in touch with a birth mother, she may speak Spanish fluently, perfectly, better than me, certainly. She may speak Quiche, Pocomchi, Hanhoal, there may be any number of different languages that this person speaks and wishes to communicate in. And that was just a complication that was going to be beyond my capacity at that time. But it wasn't a language issue, really. It was a pretty transparent ethical issue.
What are your thoughts on having some of the mother's stories being told? Betsy just raised a good point about, could they advertise somehow for them to contact you or to contact someone to have their voices kind of to be elevated?
Yeah, there are some scholars who have worked with birth mothers. So I don't want to say, it's totally unethical in every circumstance. I just thought as a, historian, I couldn't really, especially because I was working with adoption files, which are supposed to be confidential. I just couldn't see my way clear to making those contacts. Different people have different experiences, and I know that some scholars and journalists have worked with birth mothers. So if there were a venue through which women who wanted to could contact me, I would obviously be very, very interested and concerned in hearing their perspectives. I have spoken with one birth mother, but she contacted me for help with something and did not want to speak on the record. So I wouldn't even, share her case, obviously. So it has happened, but it's somewhat infrequent. If you Google Guatemalan adoptions, now you find me quite quickly, but that has not been my primary experience. Although my friends and colleagues who've written books say that books have a long life and a way of having their own lives. So maybe with this book published just recently, I'll get a few more of those phone calls or that contact information. And my email is very easily accessible online if anyone wants it. So I'm rbnolan@bu.edu. It's very easy to find me online because I teach at a university.
And if there's any other questions, you can put those in the chat and we can continue the discussion. Going back to some of what you had previewed a few things at the beginning of your talk, is there anything you wanted to go deeper in from that in your overview?
Sure. I guess one thing that we haven't spoken about very much is the role of religion. And that has been a sort of profound element of adoptions from Guatemala since the beginning. The people who adopt foreign families who adopt from Guatemala are a very mixed bunch. People adopt in solidarity, from very left-wing political positions during the Civil War with a lot of knowledge about what happened. People adopt because they're Pentecostal and feel called to adopt, and maybe have a lot of knowledge of what's happening in Guatemala, may even have served as missionaries in Guatemala. And then people of all political stripes adopt without a lot of knowledge of what's happening in Guatemala at the time that they adopt. So you really see a wide range of commitments, of kind of language access. One thing that I found, and I was really trying to research what made children adoptable within Guatemala, but of course you need a kind of outside group of people who want to adopt those kids for that research to even make sense. And a constant that I found was religious calling, right? People being either very faithful Protestants of various stripes or Catholics. And some of the Catholics were very involved during the Civil War in placing children abroad. So it's a kind of spiritual element to adoptions that can be quite complex when you are then later talking about falsified paperwork or war crimes, certainly.
For the adoptions that happened, I was curious about with the in-country adoptions within Guatemala, that you mentioned that there were some that happened within country as well as out of country. Can you talk about the differences and how the process was with both?
Sure. One thing that really surprised me when I started to do this research, I knew that Guatemalans adopt as well. And I'll explain that a little bit. I knew Guatemala as a out adopting country, like South Korea, like Russia, like China, a country that sent huge numbers of children abroad for adoption. So I hadn't realized that Guatemala was also in a very small way on the international adoption market receiving children, but they were wealthy Guatemalan families receiving children from Costa Rica and receiving children from Ukraine. This was in the 80s and 90s. Yes. And those on the call who have been to Guatemala are aware perhaps of the quite intense anti-Indigenous racism, but also colorism in that country. So wealthy, elite, whitish looking Guatemalans were trying to adopt whiter looking children. And that's how you end up with adoptions from Ukraine. So that was a real surprise to me. Those are a small number of cases, but lawyers brought that to my attention many times. What you often hear in Guatemala is that there's so-called no such thing as a adoption culture here. Like, oh, we had to send children for adoption internationally because no one adopts children in Guatemala. And that's just not true from what you can tell from the records. What you have, especially in the Maya Indigenous community, is a very strong tradition of informal adoption, of people taking in extended kin, of people caring for children who are their neighbors. So if you look at the refugee population that fled across the border into Mexico during the Civil War, you see large numbers of orphans being raised by other families. They're not adopted, but there's this kind of very strong informal adoption network. So I've always sort of taken exception to that idea that, Guatemalans don't adopt. Finally, and I think that this is your question, Ty, what happened to the children who were forcibly disappeared during the war? Some of those children ended up adopted within Guatemala, especially in elite families or military affiliated families. And that's a form of domestic adoption related war crime that's much more familiar from Argentina. So, for example, there is a child named Oscar, who was taken in after a horrific massacre in the early 1980s, the Dos R's massacre, and he was taken in and raised by one of the perpetrators of that massacre. And Steven Spielberg actually executive produced a film about his case called Finding Oscar. That's the kind of most famous case internationally, but there were a number, well, hundreds of children who were taken, forcibly disappeared by the army. The Truth Commission report run by the Catholic, there are two Truth Commission reports in Guatemala run by the Catholic Church and the United Nations, and they found that 5,000 children were forcibly disappeared during the war. And the official number for international adoptees from that group was 500. So what happened to the rest of the children? Some of them were taken as domestic servants and some of them were adopted domestically.
Thank you. Another question was, what's happening with adoptees or with children in Guatemala today, now that the adoption isn't open? Are they in foster care, orphanages, being adopted in country?
Yeah, so when I went to visit the Consejo Nacional de Adopciones, which is the kind of National Council of Adoptions, they told me that the numbers of children in orphanages has risen. So that's of course very troubling. The thing that I would point out is the vast majority of children who were adopted from Guatemala did not come from orphanages. They came from these private arrangements with lawyers. So we don't know in many cases what, there's no sort of obvious, since they aren't being adopted, this is what's happening to those children. There's no obvious way to track that. What I do know is that the conditions of extreme poverty that forced a lot of women to make that choice are still very present in Guatemala.
We had another question about DNA testing. Are there kits being offered to Guatemalan adoptees and birth families to help them locate one another?
Yes, if you go to, I'm going to tell you what is supposed to be happening, and then I hope that it is actually happening in the deed, not just in the word. But if you go to the National Adoption Council's website, this is the Guatemalan Consejo Nacional de Adopciones, the one that I just mentioned, they are offering some DNA testing. What I have heard, and this is informally, my book is historical, as I keep saying, but I have been in touch with a lot of adoptees over the years. What I've heard informally is that sometimes it can be quite slow, or you have to get in touch many times, or, for a North American unaccustomed to the kind of slowness of things in Guatemala, sometimes you might have to follow up many times. But I would look at the Consejo Nacional de Adopciones, certainly. I would look at Mako's group, especially if you think that some kind of crime perhaps has been committed. That's in English, it's the League of Mental Hygiene, which sounds like less weird in Spanish, frankly. And you can also get in touch with the forensic anthropologists. But I wish that there was this one centralized DNA bank where everyone who is missing someone can put their DNA, missing someone from the Guatemalan side, right? Like families that suspect that something has happened or are looking for someone can put their DNA, and everyone in North America, Canada, and Europe can put their DNA and they can match, and that can work. That doesn't exist. I really wish it did. It's kind of fragmented.
So what are the takeaways if we had to look at your research in Guatemala? What can we learn and from this country's experience, other countries' experience, and improve the system overall from your point of view?
It's a great question. I think Guatemala is such a hard place to study and learn about this because it combines two really difficult patterns. The first pattern I've already mentioned is anti-Indigenous violence. So I think one lesson is in any country or context in which Indigenous children are being placed with non-Indigenous families in large numbers, we should take a closer look at the dynamics of those adoptions and whether they're truly even close to consensual. That's the first kind of takeaway. The second takeaway it has to do with conflicts, right? One of the major things that I learned by writing this book is that we by now all recognize sexual violence tragically as a common part of global conflict, right? If you see a major war, if you see a genocide unfolding, certainly, if you see any kind of armed conflict, human rights workers know to be asking what's happening in terms of sexual violence there, right? One thing that I learned is that this is a global problem. We should also be asking what's happening in terms of children being taken forcibly from their families. It's not just Guatemala, it's wartime Argentina, Francoist Spain, Nazi Germany, all had adoption programs. So on the one hand, you see the anti-Indigenous violence, and on the other hand, you see this kind of totalitarian violence. And in Guatemala, because of the dynamics of the war in the 1980s, those two patterns really came together. And then I guess the final thing that I would say that is maybe more relevant to larger numbers of adoptees is the worst case scenarios, like kidnappings for adoption, like fraudulent paperwork, really poison the well for the rest of adoptions. It injects so much uncertainty into the entire historical record to know that any of the documents are falsified, that even if you have so-called good adoptions, it's very difficult to kind of ascertain what your own story is and how you fit into this larger history when even a few papers have been falsified. And we know in this case that more than a few papers have been falsified. So that really poisons the well for everyone.
I have put some links in the chat for an evaluation to tell us, to give us feedback on this presentation and ideas for things we'd like to do moving forward. We'll be sending out an email to following this presentation with a link to the recording, and then also since Rachel is willing to share some of these great resources that she's discussed, we'll include those as well. And then you know, hopefully be able to get those out to everyone. And if there's any, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions if anyone wanted to ask before we wrap up.
Maybe I can also end on a lighter note if that's, I mean, possible.
Sure.
I've just put my email in the chat for anyone who'd like to be in touch. I'll also say, you know, I'm talking about these big themes. I'm talking about violence. What you see reading adoption files from Guatemala is also this kind of randomness of life, right? Which is, you know, there were a couple of stories that I learned through interviews or through reading records where it seemed one woman had been interested in giving up her child for adoption. She was actually quite wealthy in Guatemala, but had left her husband. I'm trying to remember how much I included in the book. She had left her husband, who I believe was a wealthy professional of some kind, in Guatemala City, and she'd gone and lived on the farm, which they owned in the kind of coffee growing region of Guatemala. And she'd become pregnant by someone else and was looking to put up that child for adoption until she decided that she didn't want to, but in order to have her husband accept that child, she pretended that a kind of farmer couple who lived in the area had gifted that child to her. And she said that she would only get back together with her husband if he agreed to formally adopt this child, who was a gift from the farmer couple, with her. So in that way, she adopted her own child, basically. She falsified the paperwork and said, you know, this is, you know, someone else's child, and we are going to adopt him and raise him, or her, I can't remember. Not that it's any of my business. And so the reason that that was even plausible to her original husband was that there was this kind of adoption network happening in the country where people were doing privatized adoptions quite frequently. So I've been emphasizing a lot the kind of violence and exploitation that was involved with Guatemalan adoptions. But you do see in the paperwork this sort of like potential for openness, or kind of, you know, some women, there were other cases where a partner was living in the US, because of migration patterns that already existed. And the woman who was left behind became pregnant and clearly wanted to, put up that child for adoption before her partner returned home. So those are cases that I was able to read and think, it's not clear what's consensual, what is a real choice in someone's life versus what they're being forced into. But you can read some of these cases and really imagine, okay, this was allowing a certain kind of possibility within very constrained circumstances for some of these women. So I do want to share that as well, because there is plenty of that in the adoption files, in addition to some of the darker histories that I've just been sharing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I think this is such a challenging topic, just from the information to gather, and your research has been really, really great that we can learn about that experience and the takeaways and how we can, we're always striving to improve adoption ethics and those types of things. So thank you for sharing your research with us. I put the evaluation link back in, it might not have come through earlier. So if everyone could just take a moment and provide some feedback, that would be great. Thank you to everyone that joined this evening, and thank you so much for sharing with us tonight and for volunteering your time this evening. As many of you know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization serving individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. We're a membership organization, and we hope that you'll consider joining as a member. To find out more about our organization and to support our work, please visit our website at adoptionnetwork.org. And please join us for many of our other programs. Thanks for being here this evening, and we hope to see you at our next Monday evening speaker series later this month. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.